On the runway, a mighty Boeing 747 was all set for takeoff. Thick fog wrapped the airstrip like a blanket, making everything look mysterious. Inside the cockpit, the pilot pushed the thrust levers forward and switched on the headlights. The engines roared, and the aircraft crossed the speed where there was no turning back. But suddenly, out of the fog, a shadow began to appear. And that shadow was another Boeing 747 coming from the opposite direction, only a few meters away. What happened next is almost impossible to imagine. The real question is, how did things reach this terrifying point? Where was the air traffic controller? And what was that one tiny mistake that gave birth to the most dangerous disaster in aviation history? This heartbreaking story unfolded on the Canary Islands of Spain and is still remembered today as the Tenerife Airport Disaster. Welcome back, viewers, to another story. This one begins a day before the tragedy, on March 26, 1977. That's when Pan Am Flight 1736, a huge Boeing 747 jumbo jet, lifted off from Los Angeles Airport. Its next stop was New York, where it picked up more passengers before heading toward its final destination across the ocean, the city of Las Palmas, in the Canary Islands. It was a chartered flight, which meant it was completely packed, mostly with elderly passengers excited for a cruise ship vacation in Las Palmas. Las Palmas is the capital of the Canary Islands, sitting just 100 kilometers off Morocco's coast and is Spain's southernmost region. With its tropical weather, it's famous all over the world. But in 1977, behind the beauty of these islands was a growing political tension. A group known as MPAC was demanding independence from Spain. And to spread their message, they often chose violent methods. One such violent act would set the stage for this disaster. After leaving New York's JFK Airport, Pan Am Flight 1736 flew smoothly over the Atlantic Ocean, with 56-year-old Captain Victor Grubbs, 39-year-old First Officer Robert Bragg, and 46-year-old Flight Engineer George Warren, along with 13 flight attendants and 380 passengers, all on board. That was the story of the first aircraft. Now, let's turn to the second one. In Amsterdam, Netherlands, KLM Flight 4805 was getting ready. This was also a Boeing 747 bound for the very same destination, Las Palmas. Inside its cockpit sat 50-year-old Captain Jacob, 42-year-old First Officer Klaas, and 48-year-old Flight Engineer Willem. Along with 11 flight attendants, there were 235 passengers waiting for their journey. After boarding, KLM Flight 4805 took off from Amsterdam International Airport, and soon both giant planes were heading toward the Canary Islands. Meanwhile, at Las Palmas Airport, two men walked toward the terminal building. They placed a bag near a flower shop, and then disappeared. Inside that bag was a bomb, ticking with a countdown timer. At exactly 1 p.m., the airport's reception desk received a chilling phone call. On the other side, a voice claimed to belong to the MPAC group, the same group mentioned earlier, and announced that in just 15 minutes, a bomb would explode inside the airport. The airport staff rushed into action, evacuating the entire building before the time ran out. Then, right on schedule, a massive explosion shook the terminal. Part of the roof collapsed and chaos filled the air. With this blast, all operations at Las Palmas Airport were suspended. Flights were canceled, and incoming planes had to be diverted. By this time, KLM Flight 4805 from Amsterdam was approaching Las Palmas, but the controllers informed the captain about the explosion and directed him to land instead at Tenerife Airport, 110 kilometers away. After a 25-minute detour, KLM landed safely at Tenerife's runway 30 at exactly 1:38 p.m. At the very same moment, Pan Am Flight 1736 from New York was also approaching Las Palmas. But just like KLM, it too was diverted to Tenerife Airport. And this is where their fateful paths would cross. Almost every flight was being diverted to Tenerife Airport, since it was the closest one available. And, as you can imagine, the small airport was soon packed with traffic. Let me explain something about this place. Tenerife Airport is located in a mountainous region, only about 2,000 feet above sea level and very close to the Atlantic Ocean. High mountains surround it, And when the ocean's moist winds hit those slopes, they suddenly rise, cool down, and quickly turn into clouds. This kind of sudden weather change is actually very common here. When Pan Am and KLM first landed at Tenerife, visibility was perfectly fine. But in no time, thick clouds rolled in and the view became much worse. Sometimes visibility dropped to only 300 meters, and the very next moment it would clear up enough to see 2 kilometers away. At this point, no one knew how long they would have to stay here. Passengers were asked to step off the plane so they could stretch their legs and refresh themselves after the long flights. Meanwhile, the KLM crew, whose aircraft would later return to Amsterdam, decided to refuel right there at Tenerife. Their plan was simple. If Las Palmas Airport reopened soon, they wouldn't waste more time refueling there. But just as they began filling the tanks, the news arrived that Las Palmas Airport was reopening. Both Pan Am and KLM reboarded their passengers, but now KLM's refueling created another problem. The taxiway was blocked. You see, Tenerife was a very small airport. Just one runway, one taxiway, and a single apron where the terminal stood. It wasn't built to handle this kind of traffic, especially not several jumbo jets at the same time. Because KLM was blocking the taxiway, Pan Am couldn't move from the terminal to the runway. So, the controllers told them to wait until KLM's refueling was finished. At 4:45 p.m., KLM completed their refueling and prepared to move. But the apron was so crowded with other aircraft that even the taxiway remained blocked. That's when the controller gave unusual instructions. He told the KLM pilots, who were parked on the west side of the taxiway, to taxi directly onto the runway itself, roll all the way down to the extreme east end, make a 180-degree turn, and line up for takeoff. Once KLM began taxiing, the controller instructed Pan Am to follow them onto the same runway, but then exit at C3 so they could clear the path, because KLM would be taking off from that very runway. By now, visibility was getting worse and worse. KLM 4805 rolled the entire length of the runway, reached the far eastern end, and turned around into takeoff position. The Pan Am pilots also started taxiing behind them. They spotted exits C1 and C2, but due to the thick fog, they completely missed C3. This was likely because C3 curved back toward the apron, making it harder to notice. On top of that, Tenerife Airport didn't have proper signboards. The runway exits were marked only on the tarmac itself, and many of these markings were missing. As Pan Am 1736 crossed exit C2, KLM's captain radioed the tower asking for takeoff clearance. And here is where a chain of confusion began. Because of the fog, the controllers couldn't see either aircraft, and Tenerife didn't even have a ground radar system. The tower started giving KLM instructions about what route to follow after takeoff. But nowhere in that message did they actually give permission to take off. Still, KLM misunderstood and thought they had been cleared. The KLM captain replied, "We are at takeoff." But whether he said, "We are at takeoff" or "We are taking off," is still debated to this day. In response, the tower simply said, "Okay." But just a few seconds later, the controller corrected himself and said clearly, "Stand by for takeoff. I will call you." This was a very important instruction, making it clear that KLM did not have clearance yet. But tragically, this crucial message never reached the KLM cockpit. At the very same moment, Pan Am's pilots, who were still taxiing down the runway and heard the radio chatter, also sent a transmission, "We are still down the runway." Both messages overlapped, canceling each other out in the static, and with that, the stage for disaster was set. Because the two radio messages overlapped, all the KLM pilots heard in their cockpit was a burst of static. Meanwhile, Pan Am Flight 1736 had already missed exit C3 without realizing it. The controller told them, "When you exit the runway, let me know," and Pan Am's pilot simply replied, "Okay." But by then, the KLM captain had already pushed the thrust levers forward, believing he had permission to take off. Inside KLM's cockpit, the flight engineer actually caught the controller's message to Pan Am, saying they were still on the runway. He quickly warned the captain, "They haven't cleared the runway yet." But for some reason, perhaps distracted by the noise or misunderstanding the words, the captain brushed it aside with a short reply. "Oh yes," and continued the takeoff. The fog was so thick that visibility was only about 300 meters. Suddenly, through the mist, Pan Am's pilots saw a pair of bright landing lights shining straight ahead. At first, they thought maybe the KLM aircraft was stopped and waiting. But in the next instant, horror struck them. Those lights were rushing toward them at full speed. The Pan Am crew desperately tried to turn off the runway to avoid the impact, but it was too late. KLM's right engine slammed directly into Pan Am's first-class section. The landing gear snapped apart, and KLM's giant aircraft skidded violently for another 150 meters before crashing to the ground. Its full fuel tanks exploded into a raging inferno. The fire was so intense that all 248 people on board KLM were killed instantly. Inside Pan Am, passengers barely had time to realize what had happened. The first-class cabin was destroyed in an instant. But in economy class, some passengers spotted holes torn open in the fuselage. Many climbed out through those gaps, while others leapt nearly 20 feet down to the runway in a desperate attempt to survive. Out of 396 people on Pan Am Flight 1736, only 61 managed to escape with their lives. More might have survived if rescue services had reached in time. But the fog made it nearly impossible for the control tower to even know what had happened. In fact, the tower only learned of the disaster when another aircraft parked on the apron radioed in that flames were rising from the runway. Emergency vehicles struggled to reach the scene, moving slowly through the thick fog. In just seconds, 583 lives were lost, making it the deadliest aviation disaster in history. Investigators later studied both aircraft's cockpit voice recorders. From these tapes, the full story of confusion and miscommunication became clear, just as you've heard in this video. The investigation concluded that the tragedy was a chain of events. The bomb explosion at Las Palmas, KLM's decision to fully refuel at Tenerife, which blocked the taxiway, Pan Am missing the C3 exit in the fog, and above all, the KLM captain beginning takeoff without final clearance, even after his own flight engineer tried to stop him. The Tenerife Airport Disaster became a wake-up call for the entire aviation industry. After this, many things changed. Radio call signs and communication rules were rewritten to prevent misunderstandings. Radar became mandatory at major airports. Clear holding points and signs on runways were made compulsory. Today, Tenerife has 2 airports. The one where the tragedy happened is the Northern Airport, while a newer one has been built in the south. It sits at a lower altitude and is far less affected by clouds and fog, ensuring safer visibility. And that is the painful yet powerful story of the Tenerife disaster. We hope you found this video informative. Don't forget to like and share, and thank you so much for your kind comments. See you again in our next fascinating story.